approached this, and I was doing paintings, and I was trying to simplify the paintings, and I eventually got upset with the idea that paintings had left sides and right sides, and where they started and where they end, and it sort of pushed me in the direction of doing these pieces, which were painted columns, which played around with the perception of three-dimensionality, and the idea was that there was a kind of apparent transparency there, maybe not so obvious in these slides by the color organization, but that you would walk around these columns. They were 90 inches high, and they were clusters of them. Each one was about 18 inches in diameter, but they were various forms. Some of them were triangular columns, some of them were octahedral columns, some of them were hexagonal columns. There were different ones, and there were color relationships all around to play around with your perception of the three-dimensionality of it. And this was my first exhibition in the Tibor Denage Gallery in New York in 1968, just before the exhibiting of this piece in the Museum of Modern Art show that was mentioned in 1968. And here you see a little bit better my playing around with the idea of the transparency of color, so that on the right you see how the color sequence makes it appear as if it's a flat surface, and you only kind of pick up through the illusion of transparency here. Makes ambiguous the three-dimensionality, the actual physical three-dimensionality of it. And then you only pick it up by looking at the bottom of the column where it breaks apart, and then you see that it's in fact three octahedral columns clustered together. And then after having played around with the idea of apparent transparency and walking around, I actually moved on to things which are physically transparent that you would see. I developed the idea of working with physically transparent things that are based on three subtractive primaries, and I had to have custom-made colors in cast acrylic sheets in what I devised as a primary yellow, a primary red, and a primary blue. And that all the pieces were variations, but based on this color cube, which was a 6-foot cube on its point, so it was 10.5 feet high. And you got lots of mixtures and changes and variations of color experience as you walk around it, as you look through it at other elements and other objects. So I was really I was sort of playing around, not to pun too much, but with the idea of being immersed in color, but I was still walking around things, and I wasn't really in things, but it was an attempt to work with the environment that the piece was in and try to get you involved in the environment. In other words, I hadn't really walked away from architecture, I guess, in a funny way. And I was still trying to do that. And probably the best piece of this whole series was a color maze that I did, which was made up of clusters of these yellow, red, blue sheets, which were put together and then filled a white room where the floor was painted white, the walls were painted white, it was just lit, and the ceiling was white, it was just lit, and you got lost in a kind of color maze. All the yellows were in the same direction, all the reds in the same direction, all the blues in the same direction, but you only got that when you oriented yourself in a certain way. And most of the time, this actually related a lot to Katz's idea of film color, because as you look through a color to beyond it, you sometimes lost perception of the fact that there was a sheet of a particular film of color there. And the funny part about this, or maybe not so funny for those people, was that people were constantly walking into these things because they lost their perceptual location and were somewhat disoriented, which I think happens for some people in the cyclorama too. So this was, these are actually shots of an installation done about 10 years ago of this piece, which was from 1970, and this shows you the drawing and the model, so you get an idea of what the organization was. And I show you this piece because I think this is the piece that I finally got you into the color and immersed you in the experience. And so, although at the time I had no notion about a cyclorama or a panorama, this is 1970, I look back on it and I realized this was really very much a step in the direction of eventually doing the cyclorama. And at the same time, I have to say that I was doing paintings, and I was working very hard on the paintings. And I'm just going to go back to paintings that I was doing in Rome, so that you see that what was happening in paintings at the same time as what was happening in these three-dimensional pieces. When I was in school, there were always lots of, there was a language we called studio language, which was, and when I was in Rome as well, where artists would come and they would look at things and they had certain phrases which, you know, were meaningful to them and maybe meaningful to others. A lot of them came out of de Kooning. It's interesting that de Kooning is up now in New York. Maybe some of you traveled up there to see it. But there were phrases like, you know, every part of the painting has to count. No part can be left out of counting. Every piece has to count. Every color has to count. Every shape has to count. Every form has to count. Well, how do you do that? What does that really mean? Well, for a student, you know, that was pretty confusing. It wasn't a very straightforward way of saying it, but it was a kind of language. There was another phrase which was, nothing can fall out of the painting. You can't let anything fall out of the painting. It all has to stay in there. And what I realized after a period of time, even though nobody used this language back in those days, I think it's much more common now, is that what they were talking about was figure ground analysis. And that's pretty common to all of us now, but it wasn't so common then for whatever reason. The abstract expressionists didn't really talk that much about figure ground and figure ground analysis. They arrived at it. If you have seen the de Kooning show and looked at the black paintings and seen how he, through the process of painting, sort of arrived at figure ground interchange, through the process of painting black and painting white and painting black and painting white, and then somehow the final painting is ambiguous as to whether it's black figure on white ground or white figure on black ground. But it's not a pre-planned, it's arrived at. And Klein was doing the same kind of thing. Well, I didn't understand figure ground interchange, I didn't even know the term, but I was working on my brother's terrace in the winter of 63, 64, and I put a canvas down, as I frequently did, and of course Rome is always sunny and beautiful. And I noticed the shadows of the railing of the terrace going right across the painting, and I looked at it and I said, that's it, that's the solution. There it is, figure ground interchange, although I didn't call it that, didn't know it. And I just painted in the shadows in blue and the light in white, and so it's a totally ambiguous presentation of whether it's white figure on blue ground or blue figure on white ground. And that was a discovery. It was not a discovery, it was kind of an Ellsworth Kelly moment, I guess. It was something that plenty of other artists had discovered before me, but it was an epiphany for me to discover that. And then I realized that I could do anything in two colors in this way, that essentially figure ground interchange only required two colors. But what would happen? Why would you ever use three colors? Why would you ever use four colors? And so I was struggling with that for a while, and then I had a realization that you could play with color in a way to make the ambiguity beyond just the figure ground interchange, just the two possibilities, that you could play with it in a way to make at least three possibilities, or maybe more, by controlling hue, saturation, and brightness. And so this was an early study of mine, right from that period, in which I took one hue, orange, and then took a shaded form of that orange, which is the same light-dark value as the blue. And so you see a kind of ambiguous figure ground interchange that's kind of multiple or cyclical in the way it organizes itself, because it can be seen as saturated colors, blue and orange, on an unsaturated ground, the unsaturated orange, or vice versa. And it can be seen as orange colors on a blue ground, or vice versa. And it can be seen as light on dark, or dark and light. And so I